We're living in the midst of an amazing paradox. On the one hand, there is tremendous disdain for Jewish people in the world today. Anti-Semitism is the most widespread racism on the planet. Hostility to the state of Israel, the homeland of the Jewish people, is pervasive. Many groups proclaim unabashedly their desire to wipe Israel off the face of the map. And one major country is actively seeking to develop nuclear weapons in order to accomplish this goal. On the other hand, thousands of people are paying to have their DNA tested because they suspect they have Jewish lineage. And they're hoping that the tests come out positive. Growing numbers of people are going through the arduous process of converting to Judaism, all in the midst of a world that has very little tolerance for Jews. And in this world, where every Jew has a target on their back, many groups with no real connection to Jewish lineage insist that they are the real Jews. They are the true Jews. In Genesis chapter 15, God promises Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the heavens. And then God repeats this promise later in Genesis chapter 22, and he adds that he will multiply Abraham's descendants like the sand on the seashore. Of course, our history has not seemingly reflected this. Some estimates place the Jews at about 10% of the world population about 2,000 years ago. Today, it's about 0.2%. But there's a tantalizing question. If Jews remained at that 10% level over the past 2,000 years, there should be about 700 million Jews in the world today. But there are only about 15 million. So what happened to all of the rest? Now, it's true that our numbers were diminished over the years due to persecution, crusades, massacres, the Holocaust, but that wouldn't account for all of the deficit. Apparently, the others assimilated and intermarried and melted into the general population. But there's another wrinkle to this question which makes it even more tantalizing. And that's because 2,000 years ago, there were only 2 of the original 12 Jewish tribes. About 600 years earlier, the other 10 tribes were exiled from the land and apparently disappeared, apparently assimilated into the lands where they ended up and have been considered lost. Many of them probably don't even remember their origins today. But there can be hundreds of millions, perhaps over 1 billion people in the world today that have some Jewish ancestry. Tonight, I want to trace the history of how we ended up with so many lost Jews and what the future may hold. The progenitors of our nation were the families of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob, we know, had 12 sons and 1 daughter, and after he had a dramatic wrestling encounter with an angel, he was given an additional name, Israel. And we know that Jacob's favorite son was Joseph. And Joseph had two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And before Jacob died, he gave these two grandchildren a special blessing, that they will each have the same status as the other sons. They will be considered some of the foundational tribes. So in effect now, there would be 13 tribes, not 12, because the tribe of Joseph, one of the original 12 sons, Joseph was split into his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. So now we have essentially 13 tribes. After they were enslaved in Egypt for 210 years, God liberated the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this took place 3,333 years ago. And God led them to the promised land after they wandered for 40 years in the desert. Under the leadership of Joshua, they conquered the land from the Canaanites, and they divided the land among 12 of the tribes. Now, I just mentioned that there were 13 tribes at this point, but the tribe of Levi, which included the priestly family, did not inherit any land. They would be supported by the tithes of the other tribes, and they would live in cities throughout the land of Israel. And aside from periodically serving in the temple, they served as the teachers of God's Torah. Now, when they first came into the land, the center of worship, the spiritual center of the people, was the portable tabernacle that they had constructed after leaving Egypt and that they carried around with them during their 40-year trek in the desert. And about 450 years after coming into the land and having this portable tabernacle called the Mishkan, King David's son Solomon finally built the first permanent structure, the first holy temple in Jerusalem. After Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam was anointed king, and the people had been concerned about the very high taxes that they had been paying to support all of Solomon's projects. And so they wanted to know what was going to be Rehoboam's policy. Was he going to maintain the high taxes of his father? Unfortunately, Rehoboam followed the reckless advice of his young advisors, and he announced that he would impose even harsher and heavier taxes. The people revolted, and they formed their own kingdom in the northern part of the land of Israel. They installed someone named Yerovam, the son of Nevat, as their king. And the only tribes that remained loyal to Rehoboam and to David's dynasty were the two tribes of Benjamin and Yehuda. These were the two tribes that occupied the southern part of the land. Meanwhile, Yerovam, who was the king up north, and again, he was the king of these 10 tribes, he feared that his subjects might maintain their connection to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, which was down south in the territory of Benjamin and Yehuda. So he set up 2 golden calves. He set up 2 idols at each end of his northern kingdom, one in Beit El and one in Dan. And he also stationed soldiers on the roads leading to Jerusalem to ensure that no one would go to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. Now, the southern kingdom was referred to as the kingdom of Judah, of Yehudah, because Judah was the much larger tribe, much larger than Benjamin. And the northern kingdom of the other 10 tribes was known as the kingdom of Israel, but it was also referred to as the kingdom of Ephraim, because Ephraim was the largest of the 10 tribes. The northern kingdom descended spiritually and continued along their idolatrous course. When they had a period of prosperity under King Yerovam II, who was the son of King Joash, this prosperity led them to become terribly corrupt morally. So now they were not just idolaters of the worst kind, they were morally bankrupt as well. They didn't have any regard for justice or for showing care to the needs of the poor and downtrodden. They also got deeper and deeper into idolatry and began worshiping Baal and the other Canaanite gods. There was also a widespread abandonment of the Torah and all of its commandments. So God sent prophets to the northern kingdom of Israel and warned them of their impending destruction unless they repented. But their pleas, the pleas of these prophets, fell on deaf ears. And so about 200 years after the kingdom that was united under David and under Solomon, 200 years after that kingdom split, the northern tribes were invaded by Assyria. Around 600 BCE, Assyria exiled 2 of the 10 tribes, the tribes of Zvulun and Naphtali. 10 years later, they exiled Reuven, Gad, and Manasseh. And 10 years later after this, the Assyrians captured the capital city of Samaria and exiled the remaining tribes. Altogether, the northern kingdom of Israel lasted around 242 years. Now, according to some understandings of a passage in the book of Amos, the prophet Amos, chapter 5, verse 3, Assyria didn't exile 100% of the people living in the northern kingdom. They only exiled 90%. And so, according to this view, 10% of the 10 tribes remained behind. But it's important to realize that not all of the 10 tribes went into exile. Aside from this possible 10% that remained behind, we know that when the 2 kingdoms first split, this is again about 242 years before the exile, so we know there were always a sprinkling of people from the north who lived down south. They might have been married to someone from the southern kingdom. They may have been living there for business reasons. So there were always people from the 10 tribes living down in the south. And according to the book of Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, chapter 30, King Chizkiyahu, Hezekiah, invited the northern tribes to return and to serve God in Jerusalem. While most remained up north, a small number did return to the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, it's important to realize and to understand that with the exile of these 10 tribes and their disappearance, because ultimately we call them the lost tribes of Israel, all that remained were the 2 southern tribes of Benjamin and Judah, plus whatever sprinkling there may have been from the other tribes, from the other 10 tribes. But this became now, it was called the kingdom of Yehudah, the kingdom of Judah. This now became the generic name for all descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So initially, we were probably referred to as Hebrews. Abraham was called an Ivri, a Hebrew. So one of the terms for the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob might have been the Hebrews, and probably more common were the Israelites, the children of Israel, because again, Israel was another name of the patriarch Jacob. So really, for most of the beginning part of our history, we would have been referred to as Israelites, and throughout the 5 books of Moses, that's exactly how God refers to the Jewish people. He says to Moses, speak unto the children of Israel, to Bnei Yisrael, to the children of Israel. But now, with the kingdom of Israel, the 10 northern tribes basically going into exile and becoming lost, all we had that remained was the 2 southern tribes of Benjamin, the small tribe, Yehuda, Judah, the large tribe. So now the generic term for any descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob became Yehudi, Jew. So we see, for example, in the book of Esther, chapter 8, verse 17, when we know that the kingdom of Judah had been exiled to Babylon, and the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians. And ultimately, there was a plot to destroy every single man, woman, and child among the Jewish people. And then we know in the Purim story, the Jews were rescued. But we're told that the people living amongst the Jews were so terrified of the Jews that the Megillah, the scroll of Esther, tells us in chapter 8, verse 17, that many of the people became Jews. That's the term that's used. Mit Yahadim. They became Jews. So we see here that this became the term for the people that descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what happened to the 10 northern tribes? The Bible in 2nd book of Kings, chapter 17, verse 6, and 1st book of Chronicles, chapter 5, verse 26, relates the names of some of the places where they were exiled by the Assyrians. The Bible tells us the places that they were sent into exile. But these locations are not clearly identifiable today. It's not so clear where these names are. Some believe that they initially went to what is the area of modern-day Iraq, Syria, and Iran, and possibly continued east from there through the Silk Route. Some sources mention the possibility that some ended up in Africa, and midrashic sources, these are rabbinic tales, mention a place where the mysterious river called the Sambat Yom. And this river flows all week long and throws up rocks into the air, but on the Sabbath day, it stops flowing and it stops throwing these rocks up into the air. And apparently, according to midrashic sources, many of the tribes live in the area of this mysterious river. Most people believe, however, that wherever the 10 tribes ended up, they ultimately assimilated and intermarried amongst the people where they were living. But it's possible, of course, that some maintained their identity or some memory of their identity. It's been a long-standing mystery, an obsession among many people to try to uncover what actually happened to these 10 tribes. Again, recall that not all of them were exiled by the Assyrians. Some remained down south with the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Some may have even remained in the land up north, but clearly at least 90% were exiled. And the Talmud, interestingly, in Tractate Megillah 14b, asserts that after they were exiled, the prophet Jeremiah was dispatched on a mission to bring back the lost tribes during the reign of King Josiah. Now, he was only able to bring back some of the lost tribes, and when these few people did return with Jeremiah, they basically intermingled with and blended in with the southern kingdom, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. In the 9th century, back all the way to the 9th century, someone named Eldad Hadani, Eldad from the tribe of Dan, appeared to the Jewish community in Kairouan. Kairouan is in northwest Africa, in present-day Tunisia. And he claimed to come from a place where the Sambat-Yon River flows, and that there were other descendants, other than himself, from the 10 tribes living there. This is quite a story. And the Jewish community of Kairouan didn't quite know what to make of this story. So they consulted with one of the leading Torah scholars of that time, whose name was Rav Tzemach Gaon. And Rav Tzemach Gaon believed Eldad's accounts and believed that they were credible, since he felt that they were in accord with Talmudic and Midrashic tradition. Now, during the Middle Ages, there was a range of views about Eldad Hadani's credibility and his claims. Some leaned toward the opinion of Rav Tzemach Gaon, and others maintained that Eldad Hadani was a fraud. Another character was Benjamin of Tudela, and he was a Spanish traveler in the 12th century. He wrote that the Jews of Persia believed that 4 of the lost tribes lived in a remote mountainous region of their country. The famous 16th century Torah scholar Rav Ovadia Mibartanura, who was from Italy, he received information from Jews of Yemen and from Muslim traders about lost tribes, descendants of the lost tribes living in desert regions of Yemen. Another fascinating character was someone named David Reuveni, apparently from the tribe of Reuven. And he came in the 16th century to Europe claiming to be an emissary of several of the lost tribes. And what he wanted to do was to enlist the aid of European nations to help these tribes retake the land of Israel from the Islamic occupiers. He was unsuccessful in convincing anyone to join him, and he was ultimately imprisoned by Spanish authorities of the Inquisition, and I believe he died in prison. In the 17th century, Menashe ben Israel, in his book Mikveh Israel, The Hope of Israel, suggested that the South American Indians may be descendants of the 10 tribes. And around the same time, the false Messiah, Shabtai Tzvi of Turkey, claimed to be the commander of an army composed of the 10 tribes. So we see that throughout history, there was always this percolation of people interested in who are the 10 tribes, where are the 10 tribes. In the 19th century, Jewish travelers from the land of Israel searched widely for the lost tribes. Over the centuries, this search was carried on by Jews, by Christians, and even by Muslims. And they traveled to practically every corner of the globe to locate these elusive lost tribes. In 1975, to bring us more into modern history, Rabbi Eliyahu Avichayil of Israel founded an organization called Amishav, which means return my people. And he wanted to seek out descendants of the lost tribes and to help them reconnect with the Torah faith of their ancestors, with Judaism, and to help them return to the land of Israel. In 2003, Canadian filmmaker Simcha Yacobovici released a film called The Quest for the Lost Tribes, where his extensive travels and research documented the discoveries that began emerging in the 20th century into many of these groups that are associated with, potentially, the 10 lost tribes. There are now 2 major organizations in the world that are working to identify and to assist remnants of the lost tribes. One is called Shavei Yisrael, which was founded in 2002, and the other is called Kulanu, which is essentially a continuation of Rabbi Avichail's organization called Amishav. And recently, the State of Israel's Ministry of Diaspora Affairs struck a special committee specifically to deal with this phenomenon. Now, currently, there are dozens, actually many dozens, of peoples in the world with possible connections to the lost tribes. For some of these people, the connections seem quite compelling, and for some groups, it's less clear. I'm going to share a short survey of some of these developments. Far from a complete survey, but just to give you an idea of to what is being discovered. I mentioned earlier that there's a tradition that some of the tribes ended up in Africa. So there are people in Ethiopia who believe that they are descendants of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Many believe that they may actually be from the kingdom of Judah and people who traveled to Africa and intermarried there. Others believe they are probably from the lost tribe of Dan, as reported back in the 9th century by Eldad the Dani. Based upon his report, based upon the claims of Eldad Hadani, the Radvaz, who in the 16th century was one of the greatest rabbinic authorities, so the Radvaz ruled that these Ethiopian peoples are from the lost tribes. In 1973, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who was the Sephardic chief rabbi of the land of Israel, he ruled that these Beta Yisrael, as they're called, from Ethiopia, are descendants of the tribe of Dan and are Jewish according to Torah law. This was the ruling of the chief Sephardic rabbi, and the following year, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who was the chief Ashkenazic rabbi of the land of Israel, essentially concurred with that ruling. However, other rabbis recommended that since these people have been out of the loop for so many hundreds of years, that they should undergo what is called the Giyur L'Chumra, a conversion to Judaism just to make sure. And that tends to be the general policy that we find. In a dramatic operation, the State of Israel airlifted over 14,000 Ethiopians to Israel within 36 hours back in 1991. Another African group is the Lemba tribe of about 150,000 people in Zimbabwe. They practice circumcision on the 8th day. They don't eat pig. They don't eat other unclean animals. And it's thought that the Lemba came to southern Africa through Yemen. A minority today, not a large percentage, but a minority believe that they are of Israelite origin. Dr. Karl Skorecki has interestingly identified among many of the Lemba a genetic marker of Kohanim, the Jewish priestly class. And many people believe that this might be proof that these Lemba do descend from the peoples of Israel. In Nigeria, there's another group of about 30,000 people called the Igbos, or sometimes the Igbos. And they may also be descendants of the 10 tribes. But this is inconclusive. Almost all of them embraced Christianity in the past, but today about 2,000 to 4,000 of them identify strictly and solely with Judaism. Now, there are several groups who emerged in India, several groups. The Bnei Yisrael, or Bnei Israel, are an ancient group that was living in India for a very, very long time. And their origins in India are not clear. It's possible that there is some connection that they have to the 10 lost tribes. At one point, there were about 20,000 Bnei Israel in India. Many of them have relocated to Israel. In northeast India, there is a group that claim descent from one of the 10 northern tribes, the tribe of Menashe. For centuries, these people have been observing a biblical form of Judaism, but they were not aware of rabbinic holidays such as Hanukkah and Purim. About 4,000 of these Bnei Menashe, the children of Menashe, about 4,000 of them have moved to Israel, and another 6,500 are waiting to go to Israel. And all of them are undergoing this Giur L'Chumra, this conversion to Judaism, just to make sure. Another tradition maintains that some of the 10 tribes ended up in China. Apparently, there were ancient Israelite communities in China going back for a very, very long time. For example, in the late 19th century, there was still a sizable Jewish community in Kaifang. It's not clear if they originated with the kingdom of Judah, meaning that they were from the southern tribes, or if they were affiliated or descended from the 10 northern tribes, the 10 tribes that went into exile and were lost. But there are still isolated descendants of this group still living in Kaifang. But when the numbers in that city diminished and the synagogues could no longer be maintained, the community began to shrivel up and there's virtually nothing left at all. I remember years ago, maybe 35 years ago, there was an exhibit at Yeshiva University in New York where I was a student, and they were showing scrolls of Esther, the Megillat Esther, which contains the story of Purim. Now, as opposed to a Torah scroll that has the 5 books of Moses, the scroll of the Megillah, the scroll of Esther, you're allowed to have illuminations in the margins. And this scroll of Esther from China had pictures of Oriental people doing martial arts kung fu fighting in the margins of the Megillah. Clearly, this was their tradition. There are ancient communities, Israelite Jewish communities in a part of the former Soviet Union that's referred to as Bukhara. It's in the area of Uzbekistan. Now, it's not clear whether their roots are Judean or from the lost tribes. Benjamin of Tudela wrote in his travelogue that they were descendants of the lost tribe of Naphtali living in this area. But the most interesting group that I wanted to mention is probably the 15 million Pathan, or Pashtun, from Pakistan and from Afghanistan. They are all today practicing Sunni Muslims. But some of them believe that they descend from a grandson of King Saul named Afghans, or Afghana. They all claim, all of the Pashtun claim, to have Israelite descent. They believe they trace themselves back to Moses and to the people of Israel. They look very Jewish. They look very Semitic, different from all the other people living in that region of the world. And they have numerous practices that are common or similar to Judaism. For example, they write amulets that have 2 Hebrew words, Shema Yisrael. Many display a Magen David, a Star of David. Many wear a 4-cornered garment, like a talit, a prayer shawl. And some of them have tzitzit, little strings that come out from the corners of these four-cornered garments. The men wear beards and they have side locks. They pray towards Jerusalem, and some of them mourn the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. They don't work on the Sabbath, and some light candles on Friday night. They fast on Yom Kippur. They have their circumcision differently from all other Muslims. Muslims circumcise their boys at the age of 13 years. These Pashtun circumcise at 8 days, as we do in Judaism. They practice Levirate marriage. The Torah speaks about if a man dies without children, his wife is to marry a living brother of his. Now, Jews don't practice this anymore. We have something that basically releases people from this practice. But in the Bible, it was practiced, and the Pashtun still practice this. The Pashtun practice the biblical laws of marital separation when the wife is having her period. And this is followed by her immersion in a body of water like a mikveh. They don't eat many unclean animals, not just abstaining from pig. They interestingly practice Ir Miklat, the city of refuge. In the Bible, we're told that if someone kills someone accidentally, not on purpose, they're chopping down a tree and the axe handle flies off, they could have been more careful and kill someone. They had to flee to a special city where they were safe from the revenge of the relatives. And the Pashtun practice this idea of the Ir Miklat, the city of refuge. What's amazing is that there are clans, tribal clans among the Pashtun that their names sound very much like the names of the 10 tribes. They have in the Pashtun the Rabbani, which sounds like Ruvain. They have Levani, which sounds like Levi. They have Gadun, which sounds like God. They have Ephriti, which sounds like the tribe of Ephraim. Interestingly, Ephraim was the largest Israelite tribe, and the Ephritis are the largest Pashtun tribe. And then they have the Shimwari, which sounds like Shimon. And interestingly and incredibly, some of the Pashtun actually have Hebrew Jewish names. Some of them are called Yaakov, some are called Shmuel, Samuel, some are called Shimon, Simon, some Yitzchak, some Yisrael, some Akiva. Now, at some point, you have to say that if they walk like an Israelite and they talk like an Israelite, you might very well have an Israelite on your hands. So what does Judaism teach about what will happen to the 10 tribes? It's actually a debate in the Talmud among several rabbis. You can find this in Tractate Sanhedrin 110b. Rabbi Akiva takes the position that the 10 tribes are lost forever and they are never coming back. Rabbi Eliezer says that just like a day is followed by darkness, but after the darkness the light returns, Rabbi Eliezer says so too it will be dark for the 10 tribes, but God will ultimately take them out of the darkness. And Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda similarly says that if the deeds of the 10 northern tribes are as they have always been, meaning if they have maintained their idolatrous ways and their corruption, they will not return. But if they repent and they change and they return to the traditions of their ancestors, then they will return. Now, what is strange is that it seems that Rabbi Akiva is contradicting dozens of clear prophecies from the scriptures that seem to say that in the Messianic age, the 10 tribes will return. There's going to be a reunification of the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. I'm just going to share 3 of these passages. The book of Isaiah, chapter 11, the prophet Isaiah, chapter 11, verses 11 and 12 says, "It shall be on that day," this is one of the Bible's most famous prophecies about the Messianic age. Isaiah says it will be on that day that the Lord will once again show his hand to acquire the remnant of his people who will have remained from Assyria and Egypt and from Parthros and Cush and from Elam and from Shinar and from Hamat and from the islands of the sea. He will raise a banner for the nations and assemble the castaways of Israel, and he will gather in the dispersed ones of Judah, both Israel and Judah, and he will bring them from the four corners of the earth. That's the prophet Isaiah. So the prophet Isaiah says in chapter 27, verse 13, "It shall be on that day that a great shofar will be blown, and those who are lost in the land of Assyria and those cast away in the land of Egypt will come together, and they will prostrate themselves to the Lord on the holy mountain in Jerusalem." And then the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 3, verse 18 says, "In those days the house of Judah will walk with the house of Israel." That's what we've been discussing tonight. These two parts to the kingdom of the Jewish people that split tragically. And there was the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And Jeremiah says in those days, meaning in the future, the house of Judah will walk with the house of Israel, and they will come together from the land of the north to the land that I have given as a possession to your fathers. And then in the prophet Ezekiel, Yechezkel, chapter 37, verses 15 to 19, the word of the Lord came to me saying, "Now you, son of man, take for yourself one piece of wood and write upon it, for Judah and for the children of Israel, his comrades. And take another piece of wood and write upon it, for Joseph, the wood of Ephraim, and all of the house of Israel, his comrades. Then bring them close to yourself, one to the other, like one piece of wood, and they will become united in your hand. Now when the children of your people say to you, saying, 'Will you not tell us what these things are to you? What are these sticks that you have?' God says to Ezekiel, 'Say to them, thus says the Lord, behold, I am taking the wood of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim.'" Don't forget, the northern kingdom was called the kingdom of Ephraim. "And the tribes of Israel." The northern kingdom was the tribes of Israel, his comrades. "And I am placing them and him together with the wood of Judah," with the southern kingdom of Judah. "And I will make them into one piece of wood, and they will become one in my hand." The prophets here are predicting, telling us that in the future, Israel and Judah will come together, that we are going to see a return of the 10 northern tribes. Now, there have been various attempts among the Talmudic commentaries to try and reconcile the view of Rabbi Akiva about these 10 tribes not returning with these biblical passages which seem to very clearly tell us that they're going to return. And I'm not sure how successful these attempts have been. But in any event, some authorities rule according to the view of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer was the one that said the tribes are coming back. God's going to bring them back. And they rule, according to him, against Rabbi Akiva because Rabbi Eliezer seems to be in the majority, since Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon's quoting other people, by the way, seems to be in agreement with Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Akiva seems to be the odd man out in this case. Now, what's quite beautiful is that the formal Jewish prayer, the main prayer that's recited 3 times a day, each day of the week, that formal Jewish prayer is called the Amidah, the standing prayer, and it has 19 blessings. 19 benedictions. On Shabbat and on holidays, it only has 7. But let's look at the 10th blessing that we recite during the weekday prayers. It echoes Isaiah chapter 27, verse 13. And this prayer says, "Sound the great shofar for our freedom. Raise the banner to gather us together from the 4 corners of the earth. Blessed are you, Hashem, who gathers in the dispersed of his people Israel." And some commentaries to the prayer book say that when we recite this blessing, we should have in mind the return of the 10 lost tribes of Israel in accordance with the Talmudic position of Rabbi Eliezer. And how appropriate and interesting it is that this is the 10th blessing of the 19th blessings in the Amidah and the standing prayer. We are truly living in exciting times, as so many potential descendants of the 10 tribes today are being discovered and are trying to return to their people.